So thank you for joining this video with us today. We're at Crabtree Farms with the 2022 Spring Master Gardener Training Class. And we are going to spend a couple of hours here, first hour with Andy, and tour the gardens and learn a lot.
Do you think that will catch? Doing right? Okay. Let's, if you don't mind, let's go ahead and head over to the potting shed and I'll kind of start over there. And yes, two of our farm cats, that is Daphne. All right, so as Melanie mentioned, my name is Andy. I'm the Director of Horticulture and Greenhouse Operations here at Crabtree, and I've worked here for 6.5 years. This is my 7th year, and I've worked in horticulture for most of my life. So I've been in professional horticulture for about 10 years. And I'm involved in many aspects here at Crabtree Farms, but one of the main things that is a highlight of my job are our 2 annual plant sales that Melanie had mentioned. The spring plant sale and the fall plant sale are major revenue and funds for the farm, and one of the major things that the greenhouse operations do. But we also will grow and start many of the plant starts that the farm itself actually plants out onto the grounds. And we're involved in some of the specialty gardening and specialty herbs and spices, things that would not be considered typical crops that the farm team would handle. Ginger, turmeric, and some of those other things that the greenhouse team will take care of. What I want to talk to you about today and get questions and stuff is we're going to go over some propagation techniques and talk about seed starting, vegetative propagating, and mixing your own soil or using different kinds of soil at home that is different than garden soil or in-ground soil. You'll learn more about that when you're on the other portion of the field trip. And then we're actually going to get to tour the 3 greenhouses we have here and talk some about greenhouse operations and what actually goes into a greenhouse or growing plants in a greenhouse. So to start with, I've set up a few things up here to talk some about our potting and propagation methods. And when we go into the greenhouse, we'll see more of this with seedlings. But we mix our own soil here, and because we're on not like a large scale, but a little bit larger than at home, we actually use a cement mixer to mix our soil with organic ingredients that we source as locally as possible. And this means that we can cater our soil to what it is we're growing. If we're using something specifically for seed starting, we make a seed starter blend. If we're wanting to do potting up of annual plants, we kind of have a generic potting soil for that. I'll alter the blend for things that prefer better drained soil or things that prefer more moisture retention and so forth. So there's a lot of benefits to understanding potting soil components and their characteristics, what they actually do for the potting soil, and being able to amend your own at home for better growing. So I want to start a little bit with what we do for seeds and seed starting. So this is a product that if you were to go to a store and buy like a bagged soil that is for seed starting, it's probably going to be very similar to this product. This is called Pro Mix, and it is a sphagnum peat based blend. Sphagnum peat is very common in the horticulture industry. It's kind of a staple for most potting or container plants. And usually there's a variety of additives based on what it's being used for. But this product for us is roughly 70% sphagnum peat, and it has perlite added to it for improved porosity and drainage. It also has pH adjusters, organic, natural components to bring the pH back up because it's sphagnum peat tends to be rather acidic, and oftentimes you want something closer to a neutral pH. And then the really great thing about Pro Mix for us is that it's inoculated with natural microorganisms, specifically a couple species that help the plant's roots absorb nutrients from the soil better. So this is inoculated with mycorrhiza. Have you all heard about that? Learned about mycorrhiza already? All right. So the benefit of seed starting things or planting seedlings in something that already has plenty of mycorrhiza means that their roots are going to be able to interact with the mycorrhiza very quickly and actually grow faster and absorb surrounding nutrients in the soil better. But this is also inoculated with some natural soil bacteria that helps reduce the chance of soil diseases or fungal issues that tend to be present when you have a very moist media that has plenty of nutrients in it with nothing there that's using those nutrients right away. And so by nutrients, I mean things like organic matter, worm castings, compost, organic fertilizers, whatever it may be. Nutrients are food. They're food for your plant, but they can also be food for funguses or slime molds or possibly soil diseases that can harm the plant. So when you have existing living organisms in your soil that are beneficial to the plants, they create a monopoly in that living zone and help reduce the chance of foreign organisms from taking over that could actually harm the plant. So for us, ProMix is what we use as our base for seed starting. And this comes with those natural organisms already in there, but it does not have readily available nutrients right away. So when seed starting, we'll talk more about seed starting and propagation in a bit, but generally with seeds, they have enough nutrients in the seed for germination to be able to put out some roots, sprout, open their cotyledons, and maybe start a true leaf. But at that point in nature, they would be starting to absorb nutrients from the soil to continue growing. They don't really have nutrients in the seed to continue beyond that point. And so when we're seed starting, we will use this product and we'll mix it with some worm castings, which is a organic material, carbon-based, and it does have kind of a well-balanced available nutrients. And we also will mix for seed starting, kind of a small dose of slow release, usually something that would feed a plant for about 4 to 6 weeks, just well-balanced nutrients. But we don't want a lot of nutrients in our seed starting blend if it's just for seed starting, and we're not planning on keeping the plant in that container for very long. So that it's basically like baking. We actually, when I'm teaching soil mixing here, we'll go over different components and ingredients, what ratios we use, what we found have worked for us, and then we mix it up in the soil mixer just like you would be baking a recipe. And then so potting soil is going to be a bit different. And I have some potting soil up here that you can touch and seed starter too. I want you to get a feel for the different textures and how that has different qualities based off what the plants need. But for potting soil, we prefer something that's a little bit more coarse and will have some aggregates, things like crushed bark or wood chip, more perlite, sand, different components to where it's just a little bit rougher, a little bit more coarse. And we also mix the potting soil. So we go through so much for our production that we buy a very large totes of a base material. That base material would be similar to what you might purchase from a landscape or supply store as like a garden soil or a generic potting soil. It's not going to be the same as Miracle-Gro bagged potting soil. Like ours is not the same consistency or components. But it does already, we buy a product that already has some perlite in it. And so when I mentioned that perlite is already in the ProMix, are you all familiar with the white porous material, what perlite is? Okay. So that product already has some in it, and when we're mixing it, we will add some of this peat-based blend ProMix to our potting soil as well, because it will inoculate it with the mycorrhiza and biofungicide bacteria, which is really good for the soil. And then we'll usually add more worm castings, more organic matter to our potting soil than our seed starter soil. It goes in both. But plants that are going to be in pots and stay there for a bit longer, our intent is for it to grow larger, they need more readily available nutrients. So we'll give them that. So they get more of the worm castings, and then our chosen organic fertilizers, usually they'll get about twice as much of that in the potting soil as what we do in the seed starter. That is something with, being able to mix it here, we can cater that depending on what the plant is. If it's in the active growing time of year, oftentimes we'll up the amount of fertilizer in a recipe. If we're potting things up in the fall or winter, usually we'll do less nutrients because the plant is not going to be growing as much, and so it doesn't actually need all of those nutrients there in the soil. So anyway, we have these different ingredients, and they do different things. So, this is a bale of just sphagnum-based peat. It's something that I don't oftentimes say like, oh, you should put a ton of sphagnum peat in your garden soil at home. It can be used as an amendment for garden soil. It definitely can be worked into raised beds especially. But sphagnum peat is a product that is not the most sustainable product out there, even though it is a staple in the horticulture industry. There are a lot of environmental concerns to the mass harvesting and usage of sphagnum peat. And its qualities in a container or potting media is that it tends to hold moisture very well, which oftentimes is good. When we think of a potted plant, it's something we don't want to have to water every day. You do want some moisture retention. But sphagnum peat also has the tendency to become hydrophobic when it dries out. And so what that means is that if it does become dry, it's being that it's organic, it's like, or an organic matter. It's not like typical soil components, sand, silt, and clay that are inorganic components. This being organic, it will change in shape and size a little bit depending on how much water is in there. This bale is dry peat, but if this was wet, it would probably double in size. It's going to expand, but when it dries in a pot, it'll shrink a little bit, and then it becomes hydrophobic, meaning it can be very slow to absorb water again. And so I tend to think that sphagnum peat works well as an additive in potting soil, but as your base for potting soil, there's a lot of problems to it. I at home use cocoa coir. I don't know if any of you all are into potted plants or house plants and stuff, but I use a lot of coconut coir, which is a milled fine product, very similar to this, that has the tendency to, it's more sustainably harvested, and it does not hold as much moisture for as long, but it does not become hydrophobic in the same way. You can rehydrate it much quicker. So when we're thinking of potting soil, like I mentioned, this is stuff that will retain moisture for the most part. Perlite's main characteristic is for aeration, porosity, and drainage. So perlite is really, I love perlite. It's awesome because it provides these pockets, these little particles within the soil that are porous. And when the soil is drained a bit and medium to dry, the perlite will have air in it. And so it provides a little bit of aeration, which is good for the aerobic nature of your plant and its roots. But when it's well watered, the pores of the perlite can absorb some water, but I don't think of perlite as being a water retaining component to the soil. That would be vermiculite, which is a different thing. The perlite will absorb that water in the pores, and then as the surrounding soil components start drying out, they will absorb water out of the perlite, and the perlite becomes aeration again. So I generally think perlite is very valuable in a seed starter blend and potting soils, just for that drainage and aeration characteristics it has. Worm castings or compost. Do any of you all compost at home? Okay. Do any of you all do worm composting by chance, or encourage? You want to, or yeah? All right. I think worms are fantastic. We do not do vermicomposting or worm composting here because we don't have the staff capacity to manage that, but it is definitely something you can get into at home. So our worm castings come from professional vermicomposting operations locally, and it's we're able to get a more consistent product out of it by sourcing it in bulk from them. So compost is going to be organic matter as well, and you'll learn more about the composting operations here on the other portion of your tour. But generally, organic matter is something that it's not going to be stable in a potting mix. Like, it's going to change over time. Anything organic tends to shift and change. So the worm castings in your soil as a plant grows, they are going to be utilized and used into the plant's new tissues. And so it's a very valuable thing to have in both in your garden soil, in ground, raised beds, potting media, all the above. But it's something that can help retain some water and offer carbon-based micronutrients to the plant for just sustained growth. So that's why we have it in our potting mixes. Generally, the initial ingredients we're using don't have, they're organic matter, but they're not readily available nutrients to the plant. And the last thing, I didn't set it up here, but we use organic fertilizer. And like I said, we'll use kind of a slow release or multi-week organic fertilizer, stuff you can buy at various garden centers. I usually either buy really large bags at a local garden center, or I'll order online when we get wholesale shipments. And there's a lot of things about fertilizer, the NPK ratios. I'm sure you all have learned about NPK. So that's something that you all would just think about at home, of what is you're growing and what kind of ratio is best suited for what you're doing. We tend to do a fairly, what would just be called general growing. So it's going to be slightly higher in N for foliar growth, but still have really good amounts of the phosphorus and potassium for root development and absorption and potential flowering. So ours is general purpose, but if you're doing something that needs more nitrogen or needs more potassium, you can amend accordingly. You all are welcome to explore up here. I need to give my voice a quick break. This blue bin is some leftover of our seed starting soil that we use, and I think you all should definitely touch it and feel a little bit about the consistency of it. The white bin over here is our well-drained. This blend is what we would refer to as our well-drained potting media. So the kind of thing that I would use for larger plants, specifically ones that I want to have good drainage in the container. Do you all have any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, I have some vermiculite here that I rarely use. Vermiculite is more of a spongy material that absorbs water and will actually hold onto the water much longer than perlite. So perlite will absorb water, but it's because it's very porous. Vermiculite will absorb water and actually expand, which can be valuable in potting medias where you want to retain more water. So when you're growing things outside, I never ever use vermiculite on indoor houseplants. But for container plants outside that might be in the full sun, some of your flowering summer annuals, things that are out in the sun and the heat, and you're worried you're gonna have to, like, as they get bigger, you're gonna have to water 3-4 times a week because it just won't retain moisture. That's the kind of the potting media where you are more likely to put vermiculite into it, because it will hold water longer and be able to supply that water to the plants for longer. It's great in like hanging pots or baskets, your big petunia pots and things like that. And the benefit of it expanding and shrinking with absorbing water is that it helps, by expanding, it helps push the surrounding soil out, and then as it shrinks, so the soil will actually shift and move a little bit, which can be valuable. Like I said, peat-based blends, when they dry out, they shrink and then become hydrophobic, and it's hard to hydrate them back up again. So having perlite or vermiculite or both in there can help stabilize the potting media in general. I know that we've talked about a lot of different ingredients, and I'm a big fan of understanding what those ingredients do and recognizing that it's important to put multiple in your media. Plants' roots in that soil zone, they want some particles or some material to be moisture retaining, and they want some particles to not be moisture retaining, and they want different things in contact with the roots. So that's why a lot of potting soil, it will have cocoa coir and sphagnum peat and perlite for drainage and vermiculite for moisture retention. And you may think that that's counterintuitive. Why would you have something to improve drainage and something to retain moisture? But having different things in the same soil is beneficial to the plant. I don't use vermiculite in our potting media because we tend to water things really, really well that I'm concerned will end up overwatering our plants. So I don't personally use it here. Any other questions about potting soil and ingredients? Do y'all want to come up and look around? We have a lot of volunteers, and so this is an area where we're working a ton, not so much in the winter when it's cold out, but it's our main work area for the greenhouse staff and volunteers during the rest of the year. We mix soil, we do seed starting, we do repotting, potting up, all the different things happen here.
Amazing explanations.
Thank you, thank you.
I use cocoa coir as well.
I mix all my own soils at home too, and I use cocoa coir as my base for all of my things.
So you put worm castings in your seed starters?
We do.
I do like one part or 2 parts.
Yeah, so depending on what the ingredients are that you're sourcing, if you're wanting to kind of mix or amend your own seed starter, like I said, we use the product Pro Mix, which is the peat base, and it has perlite, but it does not have any fertilizer or nutrients. Pro Mix product does not. So we do put worm castings in, and we do put a 533 kind of 4 to 6 week fertilizer in there. But both the worm castings and the fertilizers are less than our potting soil. I do about half of the fertilizer in the seed starter and about 2/3 of the worm castings in the seed starter.
So on seed starters, you get them like probably this big. But I
wanted to repeat. He had asked about seed starting, so I'll talk more about seed starting when we're actually in the greenhouse, and y'all can see some of what we do. But as I had said earlier, when we mix our seed starting soil, there's less nutrients in it than our potting soil, and for multiple reasons. But we will do seed starting in plug trays. If y'all aren't familiar with that, I mean, we'll see some in there. We'll also do seed starting in like mass amounts of seed starting in open trays or smaller cups or old food containers. We don't ever seed start in a retail pot, or we don't ever seed start anything in a grower's pot, if that makes sense. If something needs to be in a pot to grow, it's not actually seed started in the pot. You seed start it ahead of time and transplant accordingly. But we will seed start into plug trays with the intent of that plant and the plug might get potted up or directly planted out. There's, sometimes there's not an exact right answer. There's multiple right answers depending on the results that you're going for.
So you wouldn't put it in a commercial pot because it's too big?
Because I can get a better result by not doing that. So let's say that we're growing, we grew 3,500 tomato plants this spring just for the plant sale. That's not even for the farm. So they all are in like 3.5-inch square pots. Those are our retail pots for them. We do not seed start the tomatoes in those pots. They get seed started separately, and then all of them are hand transplanted into those pots. And so we do that because we can get a better quality result of the plant by transplanting the better quality plants to start with and cull the others. And it allows us to stabilize the plant if they're leggy, inspect the roots, things like that. Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so we have 3 greenhouses here, and we're going to get to go in all 3 of them. But before we start, I do want to mention that all 3 greenhouses predate me. They've been here longer than I've worked here. They were all 3 built at different times, so they're numbered. Greenhouse 1 is the oldest, Greenhouse 2, and then Greenhouse 3 is the newest greenhouse. Because they were built at different times and likely by different Crabtree staff and everything, they are all 3 different designs. And we're going to talk some about the basics of a greenhouse and greenhouse operations, but you'll notice that those things vary from the 3 greenhouses because they are different. And by having the 3 greenhouses be different, I'm able to learn which greenhouses tend to be better to grow different kinds of things for us. So as a small urban farm, if we were only focused on our farm crop production, we probably could utilize just one greenhouse for all of the needs of growing those plant starts. The 3 greenhouses, the reason for having more than one is because of our large plant sales. We're only able to do that because of having more greenhouse space to grow those plants. It also allows us to grow some specialty crops like microgreens, edible flowers, and a variety of unique herbs, both for retail and restaurant wholesale. So anyway, we're going to start with the first greenhouse here. This is greenhouse 1, and I'll let you all go ahead and start heading in there, and I'll follow. So that way you all can hear me. All right, so this greenhouse, this is greenhouse 1, and it has a design that allows us to tier plants. And so when we're in our larger production times, spring plant sale, essentially, we will utilize the lower table set, and we'll also put some plants up on this upper deck, giving us more surface area to work with. When you're thinking about the greenhouses, though, there's a few things to keep in mind, and some of that is overcrowding a greenhouse. If you have plants down low and then things on top of them, that's going to hinder light getting from the plants that are below. It also will hinder airflow, and that you also tend to have more disease or pest issues in a greenhouse that's overcrowded. So I've jumped the gun a little bit. Before we get into that in more detail, I want to ask, what are some things that you notice in the greenhouse? Like what's in here? What makes this a greenhouse? It's warm, yeah. What else? The airflow? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so what I was really wanting to point out is the airflow and some of our greenhouses are low-tech greenhouses. You could go much more high-tech, but some of the essential things with the greenhouse are going to be openings. A totally enclosed greenhouse has very different management needs, which can be more challenging. So at the front of the greenhouse, you'll notice we have shutter vents. And at the back of the greenhouse, that is actually an exhaust fan. When it turns on, those shutters will open. And so those are all connected to thermostats that we can adjust the setting on. So we're at a certain temperature, the front vents will open just to release some air and allow some air exchange. And then at another temperature, the exhaust fan would kick on, and it will actually suck air out of the greenhouse. But the vents at the front being open, it'll draw fresh air in. So that's a way of preventing the greenhouse from getting too hot, ideally, but also encouraging some airflow and air exchange, which is really good for plants in a greenhouse for multiple reasons. The 2 fans that we have in all 3 greenhouses, they'll look different in all 3, but these are called circulation fans. They stay on 24/7, and they are just to maintain some kind of air circulation in here at all times, so that way it's not stagnant air. So on that note, the reason why airflow is important is that plants naturally and outside, they would be getting wind and breeze, they would be getting airflow, and airflow helps reduce the chance of pests or things on the plants. Now, of course, we always have pests, and we'll manage them with integrative pest management and organic controls, but having airflow definitely reduces pest issues. It also reduces disease issues. Oftentimes, diseases are caused by bacterial or fungal, as well as viral organisms. And when you have stagnant air, you're more likely to have sporulation or diseases on the plant that can then spread very quickly. Airflow tends to reduce that a little bit easier, a little bit more. It makes it easier to manage. It also helps our plants to actually dry out a bit. So oftentimes we think of plants like we want to keep them wet, we got to keep them watered all the time, but drying out is very important for plants. They want good moisture depending on their needs, and they do want to be watered accordingly. but you do want plants to dry out in between waterings a bit for their own health, to prevent root rot and soil diseases and soil surface diseases. So airflow is generally important across the board for plant health. But in a greenhouse setting, or I'm very big into houseplants at home, and having some airflow for a collection of houseplants is also important. So those are one major thing in the greenhouse. The other thing you'll notice right there is a heater. Because our spring plant sale is such a big deal to the farm, and we pride ourselves on growing virtually all of our plants here for our spring plant sale. But what that means is that we're doing a lot of the growing for a spring plant sale during a non-favorable time of the year to be growing plants. My spring starts in December. Being a greenhouse employee here, my seasons tend to be about a season ahead. So my spring is over, long over for me. But that means that we need to be able to heat the greenhouses during the winter. A lot of people think that, oh, greenhouses, it's warm all the time. It collects from the sun and it stays warm all the time. And that's not quite true. The greenhouse effect works if it's sunny. If it's cloudy, like it's working, but it's not nearly as warm in here as it would be if it was sunny right now. And during the winter, our days are shorter. Our overcast days are much more prevalent, and it tends to be colder, obviously. So there's a lot of heat loss through the poly or plastic or whatever material a greenhouse is made of. There are more energy efficient types of coverings, but either way, supplemental heat is oftentimes necessary. And we have a large propane tank. All three of our greenhouses have propane-based heaters that are also connected to thermostats. So during the winter, we can heat the greenhouse. At home, I would, so unless you're doing production or like have your own homestead, I think a propane-based heater is completely unnecessary. It's an expense that we do because we do greenhouse operation. And then I do want to point out the grow lights in here. Grow lights are something that we can move around. Sometimes we have more grow lights in the greenhouse. At other times we take them down. But supplemental lighting, it can be very important. It's something that we pretty much only utilize during December through March when we're trying to grow spring plant sale plants at a time of year where the days are very short and there's a lot of cloudy days. And we want to give our plants a boost in their photo period so they grow better. So that's what the grow lights tend to be for. A lot of these I'm actually probably going to take down soon for the season. So anyway, that's kind of the basics of this greenhouse, and you'll notice some of those same components in the other two greenhouses. Right now, this greenhouse has some remnants from spring plant sale, which is now over, although we'll continue selling plants for the next couple months. And you'll notice some of our very small microgreen operation. We pretty much only do about 8 to 10 trays a week of microgreens. It's a fun side enterprise, but not something we do on large scale. Do any of y'all have any questions? Yes, yeah. Yes, that is a microgreen harvester. So it's also a salad green harvester, and the blade is currently exposed. So please be careful and don't actually like touch it. So what that is it's non-motorized. It uses a power drill as the motor on an oscillating blade and that brush roll that you see. And it can be removed from that mount and actually taken out into a raised bed or the field to harvest like say baby salad greens, spring mix or arugula or spinach. It can also be used for microgreens, which is primarily what we use it for. And so it's mounted, we can adjust the height. And as long as we have microgreens like these that are standing fairly tall and straight and uniform, instead of having to harvest those by hand with sanitized scissors or sharp pruners, we can run the entire tray through there and harvest an entire tray in about 8 seconds. So it's very valuable for us to speed up our operations. It would be especially valuable if we were doing more trays per week. His name is Edward, after Edward Scissorhands. Yeah.
What kind of soil mix do you use for microgreens?
Yeah, so we like to grow our microgreens to a little bit larger size, where we can actually see a true leaf on them. And I've experimented with different methods, but I like using these deeper trays. So these are what we call 10-20 open trays. They're 10 inches by 20 inches. And these are kind of the full depth open trays. We do also have half depth ones, which would be a great way to grow microgreens with less expense or less materials use. I like to use about 50% of our potting mix as the base layer, and then the top layer, 50%, is our seed starter. And we have pretty good success with doing surface sow microgreens. So our staples are going to be brassica type things, brassica families, so cabbage, kale, collards, broccoli, etc. And most of those we're able to do as a surface sow, lightly water and mist them, and then put them in a controlled humidity chamber for 48 hours. These are sprouted. All of these were sown on Tuesday afternoon. It's Saturday. So different varieties sprout at different rates, but they'll all be ready for harvest. Not this coming Tuesday. This is for this coming Tuesday. These will be the following Tuesday. They're a 14-day rotation. And if it's something that we're not able to control the relative humidity above at the surface very well, then we would possibly cover them or mist them more regularly. But yeah. And then here at the front of the greenhouse, as we can go ahead and start leaving and go into another greenhouse, but you'll notice a few potted plants that are blooming. Those are production nasturtiums. They are edible flowers, and so we actually harvest those.
How long in the season will they grow? I love nasturtiums. It seems like the heat of summer kills them, right?
Yeah, well, I do about 6 successions of nasturtiums a year, and so it's something that we grow nasturtiums for edible flowers for our wholesale partners, and we'll do it year round. My best nasturtiums are my greenhouse grown winter ones. These are doing pretty well, but we will continue doing new successions of them and growing them in a shade cloth covered greenhouse or outside in an afternoon shady area where they get morning sun or afternoon shade. Nasturtiums definitely are not going to go all summer long. I'll do about 2 successions in the summer. The heat does end up being too much for them.
So could you plant them now and have them go till July or August?
These 3 trays that you see right there, they are just coming into production for us for edible flowers. And they, what is it? Still beginning of May. They will probably go into July, and then I'll pitch them and we'll have a new round going. All right, so this is Greenhouse 2. Greenhouse 2 has a different design, and I'm actually not going to go in here because it's a little bit too loud to talk, but I do want you all to explore and at least see the different design in there. The tables, the table covering and wiring is different. I believe the tables in here are actually older than the tables in Greenhouse 1 and are in need of some repair. So you'll notice some of our infrastructure is a little bit rustic and we get by with that. But one of the main differences is that this greenhouse and the other greenhouse, we have just recently put shade cloths on them for the season. And the shade cloths will reduce the amount of light that goes into the greenhouse, which affects plants' growth a little bit. But it can be beneficial for things that actually want some shade, especially in the summer. More importantly is that it will keep our greenhouses a bit cooler during the summer. We cannot grow things in our greenhouses in the summer. It's just too hot. Even with the exhaust fans and air circulation, it's very hard to grow things in a 97-degree greenhouse. And so we will shade cloth them. Greenhouse 1, now that the sun peaked out, it actually would be fun to explore in greenhouse 1 without a shade cloth and see how warm it gets very quickly on a sunny day versus one that has a shade cloth. This greenhouse is a taller dome and has a different table layout, and so I actually use a shade cloth. I believe this one is a 35% shade, like light reduction, whereas the shade cloth over here for this greenhouse is about 25%. So this greenhouse is shadier, and I kind of do that on purpose for various reasons. I'll explain that when we go into the next greenhouse. But I'd like for you to go in there, see what we have. There's not a whole lot going on in this greenhouse. It's mostly just leftovers from spring plant sale, but it will be where we store a fair amount of our summer perennials that will lead up to our fall plant sale in September. So you're welcome to explore in there a little bit. Me here, I'm wanting to shade the entire thing, and I'm really wanting to cool the greenhouse, and that's much easier if your intent is to keep the greenhouse cooler. I think that's going to be more effective with the external shade cloth that provides more covering, as opposed to an internal one where light is still getting in there and doing the greenhouse effect, which will warm the greenhouse. Do you have a greenhouse at home, or thinking about something? Okay. Okay.
Ventilation, and I haven't heated it yet. We went through one winter.
Right. I think heating, doing winter heating or supplemental heating on a greenhouse at home is very much dependent on what you have in there, or like what you're growing. Being able to heat it a little bit in the late winter, early spring, if you're growing a lot of your own spring plants, if you have property or gardens and you're doing that, that can be very valuable. I think we have heaters in all 3 greenhouses. However, based off of how I strategically grow different kinds of plants, or the ones that actually need heat for cost effectiveness and energy efficiency, we will cram as many of those tender plants or heat loving plants into one greenhouse for the majority of the winter. So we're only actually having to heat one greenhouse. And then as we expand our production, I'll keep them in a second, I'll expand over into just a second greenhouse. And then by the time that we have tender, basically the annuals, the tomatoes and flowers, by the time that we have tender plants that are in all 3 greenhouses, hopefully that is late enough into the winter or early enough into the spring that we may not actually need to heat or use the heater in that 3rd greenhouse, if that makes sense. So at home, it's just kind of what you're growing or what you're doing, and the shade cloth would also be how you want to go about it.
Are you trying different percentages to get a different?
Yes and no. So like I said, I've been here for going on 7 years, and some of this is like, well, I inherited what was already here, and have been able to make some changes along the way. But we have the 3 greenhouses and we have 3 shade cloths, and so I use what we've had and is still good and we've had for a number of years. But I do intentionally put less shade on the lower domed greenhouse here, and then because of that, I will tend to grow more heat loving plants in there, and I'll put the higher shade cloth on this greenhouse and put things in there that will still be okay growing in the summer, even with less light. Not only do shade cloths affect the temperature in the greenhouse, and that's beneficial to be cooler, but by reducing the amount of light that they get, it definitely affects their growth. So something that would prefer to have full sun, having it in a greenhouse all summer with a shade cloth that cuts out about 35% of the light, that basically would be the equivalent of being in part shade or overcast days every single day, and that will affect their growth. If it's a plant that wants full sun and it's in the shade, it's going to have longer internodal spacing in between the leaves. It's more likely to become leggy, less dense with the leaves. It might affect the leaf size or leaf shape because they're not able to get the kind of light that they would want. So I do have a right to recognize that during the summer we have the shade cloths on the greenhouse to keep them cooler, but there may be some plants that I want to keep outside because they want more light, and so I won't actually put them in the shade cloth greenhouse. Right now we have a lot of blueberries. Those are our retail blueberry plants in here. They're in there so that way they don't dry out and die on me. I can keep them better watered by being in the shade. Yeah. All right, so we can go into greenhouse 3. Greenhouse 3 is the newest one. And I was talking about heating the greenhouses, and for energy efficiency in the winter, greenhouse 3 here is usually what we cram the vast majority of our plants into over the winter. By having more mass, more soil mass, more plant mass, just more mass in the greenhouse. It's like your refrigerator or freezer at home. It's more energy efficient if there's more mass in there. And so during the winter, we will supplement heat this one if needed, because we'll have a lot of tender perennials, edible flowers, microgreens, and tender annuals all in one greenhouse. And I will have to set the thermostat to a minimum temperature. For me, that's usually 45 degrees Fahrenheit is what I have as the minimum in there during the winter. And I just hope for the best, like tough love. You may not be happy at that cold of temperatures, but you're gonna live. And like me, let's just get through the winter to spring, because I don't like the winter either. And so that's kind of how we treat this greenhouse. The reason why I choose this greenhouse for that warmer greenhouse in the winter is because it has a lower dome ceiling. And so heating it with the circulation fans in there, I find that it's more stable and more energy efficient than trying to heat a larger capacity greenhouse. I also just really love the table layout in this greenhouse. It's more of a open level. It does not have multi-tier. I mean, of course, we can put things down on the pallets, down on the ground below, which I rarely do. That's usually when things are down below, it's because they can handle deep shade, less airflow, or it's a temporary spot for them. The prime space in the greenhouse is the main tables. We just put the shade cloths on these two on Thursday. But meanwhile, you'll notice that we have quite a few pepper plants and some other sun-loving plants in here. And now that there's a shade cloth on here, we'll probably start moving some of those pepper plants outside where they're getting full sun, because they're destined for our fields here, which is going to be full sun. And if they're too acclimated or used to a shade cloth greenhouse, they won't be hardened off or acclimated. So they need to be outside for a bit before going to the field. Anyway, we can go ahead and come in here and look around. So those are some more of our edible flower production. So all that particular table, anything on there is being grown for edible flowers. And this side of the greenhouse is peppers. Because we have the space and I don't have to cram things on the tables, we didn't do it on that table so much, but this table, notice how we've sort of spaced out the trays a little bit. If you don't need to jam or cram the plants in there, by spacing them out, it just allows for better ambient lighting and airflow between the plants and the trays. Also lets some light down into the stuff that I have below. And over here, some of this is leftover spring plant sale stuff, and some of it is all new succession. Succulents are something that are popular and we sell at our plant sales in the farm stores. So we're always kind of propagating succulents and potting up new rounds of it. We just potted up 40 new ones that will be ready for release in about a week. So they'll be at farm store and market and things like that. Otherwise, you'll just see some oddball project plants in here. And the tables in here where I did not build these are rather large and can be difficult to reach the stuff in the middle. And so if you had a greenhouse at home, oftentimes you're thinking about how do you maximize whatever the square footage or the space is of your greenhouse. You want to use it to the best of your abilities, but sometimes smaller tables might be more advantageous because you can actually reach stuff. I do like this design. It allows for a lot of surface area for growing things in here. It's just sometimes hard to reach stuff at times. One thing that I do not like about this greenhouse, and if I were to set up a fourth greenhouse or remodel this one, is the curvature of this dome comes all the way down here to this level. And these tables were built in here to be a little bit higher, which is at times nicer because by being higher, we can actually do hands-on work. It's not so low, but it makes it difficult to put plants all the way up here against the edge because this curvature of the dome is too close. So usually when we are cramming plants in here, we'll have a little bit of wasted table space because I usually won't put a tray any closer than that to the plastic. They need room to grow. They need to not be too close to the plastic for sun exposure or burning. So in hindsight, you know, if I were thinking about model and design, I probably would choose to have the tables either be lower or to have about a 12-inch straight up rising before the curvature of the dome starts. So just some things to think about if you're doing any kind of a greenhouse or even just a hoop house or cold frame structure at home, of being aware of that height and how close you can put plants close to the edge. Anyway, I'm not for sure where we are on time. I think we probably started around 9:40. We've been at it for about 45 minutes. Okay, 55. Okay, great. Then that means we're basically at the end of my portion. Why don't we head back out, and I would love to take some questions before we switch over.
Quite interesting.
Huh?
I said quite interesting.
Thank
I
you.
have a
Yeah.
Question. maybe
Yes.
I'm not
Question regarding rooting propagation or rooting raspberries. So I'm hoping that you all have talked about seed starting and stuff like that in another class. We do a lot of seed starting here, but seeding is just one way of propagating plants. A lot of stuff is done by vegetative propagation, which involves rooting cuttings or division of a plant, or tissue culture, which we don't actually do here, but we'll get plugs, like baby plug plants in, pot them up, and further grow them out. So rooting cuttings is one of my favorite things. We will propagate a lot of figs, and we do blackberries. Raspberries I normally buy in the starts and grow them out to finish. But they are a bramble. And then we'll also do a fair amount of herbs. We'll root cuttings on lavender, rosemary, sage. Mint, we don't really bother with cuttings. We just divide that and like throw some cuttings in some soil, let it go. The whole trying to root it in water first is completely unnecessary. So for rooting something, you brought up raspberries, and generally bramble varieties, your blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, or brambles, they can root very well. And when I have done blackberries, I actually don't bother with water propagation on anything here. I do media propagation, but we will use rooting hormone. You can buy the rooting hormone powder that's got the active hormone ingredient, very diluted. We will use that. I also use Clonex, which is much more expensive. It, excuse me, I've been talking a lot. So Clonex is a product that has the same active ingredient as your more common rooting hormone powder, but it's about 3 times as strong, and then they have a proprietary blend of nutrients in there. So you get a much better success rate, which I really like because I'm never going to be doing 1 or 2 blackberry canes. I'm going to run a batch of 100 or 200 if I'm going to do it. And so having a good success rate is important. So I think using rooting hormone at home is great and oftentimes does help. And then growing rooting in a media. So basically we do it in our potting soil with added perlite. I would do it in just a very well-drained mix, the kind of blend that I would be growing lavender in or something, or a succulent mix. So just more perlite, better drainage, and then probably putting it in a bit more shade than it might like to be growing in. Otherwise, controlled watering, controlled relative humidity, and warm temperatures, and hope for the best, which is basically what we have at this time of year. It's now warm, it's humid, so as long as you have good airflow, fans, good airflow, and making sure you're controlled watering, it likely can root in a pot of media. So best of luck on your raspberries. Yeah, like all the time. Yeah, I sometimes accidentally break a limb off of a tree and like, oops, I guess I'm gonna have to root this now. Rooting stuff is really fun. If you're interested in learning more about that, I do encourage you to come out and volunteer with me here. We do the vast majority of our rooting batches in the summer. So we will start rooting rosemary, we'll start rooting figs, the kinds of things that we propagate from rooting cuttings. We'll be doing that starting very soon over the summer, and that will be for our 2022 fall plant sale and 2023 spring plant sale. I'm about ready to start 2023 figs. So it'd be great to have some volunteers and we can learn all about that. Any other questions? Because I don't see the next group quite yet. Well, there's Diane. Okay. Yeah. I am happy to take more questions though, and I think we'll have a time after your next portion.